Let's move to our next topic, that is method overriding in case of exceptions. In this topic, we are going to learn that if parent class method is throwing some exception and child class overridden method is also throwing some exception, then there are some certain rules that must be followed in order to achieve method overriding. Okay, what are those rules? What are those protocols that we must have to follow in order to implement method overriding in case of exceptions? Those rules we are going to learn in this topic. The first thumb rule says that if parent class method is throwing some exception and child class method is also throwing some exception, and both exception classes are having parent child relationship between each other, then we will be easily able to achieve method overriding. Okay, you can understand this by this hierarchy diagram. If parent class method is throwing exception class type of object and child class method is throwing some IO exception type of object or SQL exception type of object or runtime exception or arithmetic exception type of object. So because parent method is throwing parent type of exception and child method is throwing child type of exception, that's why we will be easily achieve method overriding in that case. As you can see in this implementation, I have base and child class. In base class read file method throwing some exception type of object, and in child class read file method, which is overridden method, throwing arithmetic exception type of object. So you can see both of these are having parent child relationship between each other. If even you will not throw arithmetic and you will throw some IO exception or something, some child of this parent one, and there is a parent child relationship between both of them, then you can easily achieve method overriding and your code will be work fine. Okay, this was the thumb rule that is applicable for both type of exceptions. Okay, now we are going to discuss about exception handling in case of method overriding in two different scenarios. One, when your parent or child method is throwing compile time exception, and another one is when your parent or child method is dealing with runtime exception. So in both of the scenarios you will have different type of rules. Let's first discuss method overriding in case of compile time exceptions or checked exceptions. Rule number one says that if parent class method is not throwing any exception, but child class method try to throw some checked exception, then that will not work. You cannot define a parent method which is not throwing any exception, and from child if you will try to throw any kind of checked exception, that is not acceptable. You cannot override the method in that case. Rule number two says that if parent class method is throwing some checked exception type of object, then child class method must have to throw either same exception type of object or child exception type of object, or even if your child method is not throwing any exception, that is also acceptable, but you cannot throw an exception type of object which is parent exception type of object. So these are the two rules that you have to take care when you are dealing with compile time exceptions in case of method overriding. Now let's discuss runtime exceptions in case of method overriding. We have quite flexible rules while dealing with runtime exceptions in case of method overriding. Let's say if your parent class method is throwing some exception, that is arithmetic exception, and child is throwing runtime exception. As you can see, runtime exception is a parent of arithmetic exception. So if your parent method is throwing runtime exception and child method is throwing any child exception object, that's fine. But even if you are doing vice versa, if your parent method is throwing arithmetic exception or null pointer exception and child is throwing runtime exception, then also it will be work in case of runtime exceptions only. These are the first two rules that I explained. Now, rest of the two rules says that if parent method is throwing some exception and child is not throwing any exception, or else child is throwing some runtime exception and parent is not throwing any exception, in those cases also code will work. Method overriding will be implement or achieve. Okay, which means that runtime exceptions are quite flexible. Let me summarize everything. In case of checked exceptions, if parent method is not throwing any checked exception, then child must not have to throw any checked exception as well. Okay. If parent is throwing some exception, which is checked type again, then child must have to throw either same type of exception or child of parent exception type, or if no exception will be even thrown, then also it will be fine. And in case of runtime exceptions, rules are quite flexible. If parent is throwing some runtime exception and child is throwing any child type of exception, that will fine. Even if parent is throwing child type of exception and child is throwing parent type of exception, that also fine. If parent is not throwing any exception and child is throwing some exception, then also fine. If child is not throwing any exception and parent is throwing exception, that also fine. So everything works in case of runtime exceptions. You just have to extra take care about checked exceptions. Okay, you can very quickly see these implementations of all those rules. In case of checked exceptions, if parent is throwing some IO exception and child is not even throwing any exception, then also it will work fine. If it will also throw some IO exception again, that also will work fine. Even if it will not throw any exception, then also it will work fine. But let's say if child is throwing some parent type of exception, because exception is a parent of IO exception, then it will not work in case of checked exceptions. And even if parent is throwing some parent type of exception and child is throwing file not found exception, which is child of IO exception, both are checked exceptions, but because those are having parent child relationship, that also work fine. So this is the last use case in case of checked exceptions. While in case of unchecked exceptions, if parent is throwing arithmetic and child is throwing runtime, runtime is a parent of arithmetic, but still it will work fine. Okay, and if you will do vice versa, obviously if you are putting here runtime and here you will put arithmetic or array index out of bound or null pointer exception, then also it will be fine because parent and child relationship is always allowed. You will find all these use cases of implementations related to method overriding in case of exceptions in this folder 6 method overriding in case of exceptions, and here you will find one file. That file is containing all those implementations or all those use cases.